In the frozen winter of 1945, East Prussia became the stage for one of the most devastating chapters of Europe's war. A land trapped between the collapsing Reich and the relentless advance of the Red Army, where entire cities vanished under fire, where armies fought not just for victory, but for time for the millions of refugees spilling into the snow to escape. This is the story of a world reduced to ruins, of commanders defying orders to save lives, of children sent to face tanks with rifles from another war, and of a proud capital city that endured until the very last shot. This is the winter of blood and ice, the final agony of East Prussia. The land of East Prussia stretched out like a vast, open canvas, its great flat plains running south from the icy Baltic between the ports of Danzig and Memel. In winter, the wind cut across those open fields like a blade. In summer, the air shimmered in the heat, broken only by the distant lines of dark forest and the glint of water in the lakes. This was a land that had been claimed and reclaimed through the centuries, ruled in turn by Prussians, Poles, and even the Swedes. Yet by 1945, it was almost entirely German. Some 2.4 million ethnic Germans called it home, along with 200,000 Allied prisoners and forced labourers, and thousands of desperate refugees from the Baltic states who had fled before the advancing Red Army. A generation earlier, the Treaty of Versailles had sliced this land away from the rest of the Reich, granting Poland its famous corridor to the sea at Danzig and handing the province of Posen to Warsaw's control. The people of East Prussia had endured it, but they had never forgotten. When Hitler's invasion of Poland in September 1939 erased that corridor and restored their land link to Germany, the celebrations here were wild. At last, they were connected again to the fatherland. Life in East Prussia was not like life in the industrial heartlands of Germany. Its very character was shaped by its old aristocratic families. Helmut Schmidt would later remark that it was a province very untypical of Germany, owned chiefly by the gentry and nobility, in which the ordinary people were dependent peasants. He painted a picture of a society balanced on a narrow upper crust, counts, barons, and princes above, with hundreds of thousands of peasants below, living on the edge of hunger. Henner Pflug, a schoolteacher there, put it more simply. The Nazis seemed to take second place in East Prussia. The aristocracy was still on top. Königsberg, the provincial capital, was where what little middle class there was tended to gather. Merchants, administrators, professionals. Out in the countryside, the great families lived in sprawling country houses, relics of another age, with tenants who worked the land for them in a relationship that felt almost medieval. For centuries before the Nazis came, the Germans of East Prussia had seen themselves as guardians of civilization in a rough land, protectors of Christian values on the frontier with the East. They used a word, Heimat, homeland. For them, it was more than just a place. It was the soil their identity was rooted in. Graf Hans von Lehndorff, a doctor who would later write one of the most haunting accounts of 1945, remembered East Prussia's mysterious splendor. In those final months before disaster came, he recalled the light being sharper, the sky impossibly high, the distances vast and endless. And it was true. Since 1939, East Prussia had been a backwater, spared the full weight of war. Ursula Salzer, the daughter of a Königsberg railway manager, said simply, "It was incredibly quiet. We had no sense of the war going on and plenty to eat." That quiet ended in the summer of 1944. Königsberg, which had so far escaped the fate of other cities, felt the war crash through its walls for the first time. At first, it was the Russians, clumsy, occasional bombing raids, but on the night of 26th August, the sky filled with the deep, thudding growl of British heavy bombers. Bomber Command had arrived. That first night, most of them failed to find the city. 3 nights later, on the 29th, they came again, this time in force. 189 Lancasters from the 5th Group roared in and dropped their loads with devastating accuracy. The fires raged out of control. Whole districts disappeared in the roar of collapsing timbers and the crack of ammunition stores cooking off. Bomber Command would later estimate that 41% of all housing and 1/5 of local industry were gone in that single raid. The price for the British was high too. 15 Lancasters shot down by unexpectedly fierce German fighter resistance. But for the people on the ground, none of that mattered. All they saw was the ruin. One of those people was a young woman named Elfriede Kowitz. Elfie, to those who knew her. Her family owned a dairy business and lived in a corner house on Neuer Graben. That night, when the sirens wailed, they took shelter like so many others. When she emerged after the last bomb had fallen, she was met with a sight that tore the breath from her lungs. Her home, her family's business, gone. In the smoke and chaos, she saw a figure in a helmet. It was her father. They fell into each other's arms and sobbed like children. The only thing he had managed to save was the family's radio. Everything else, a lifetime of work, lay in ashes. Her bitterness was a wound that never healed. She would later say, "That raid was so futile. It did nothing to shorten the war." From that night until the end of the war, she never fully undressed to sleep again. The sound of the sirens made her shake uncontrollably, and in that she was not alone. In Königsberg, the war had finally arrived, and it would not leave until everything was finished. Not everyone beneath the Allied bombs cursed the distant drone of engines overhead. For a few, that sound carried a dangerous kind of hope. Among them was a 16-year-old Königsberg boy named Michael Wieck. Because he was Jewish, he was forbidden entry into the city's air raid shelters. When the sirens wailed, he had to make for the coal bunker, a cramped, dusty place where the air smelled of soot and the wooden beams creaked above his head. He would hear it first as a faint, insect-like hum somewhere above the clouds, then a low, swelling roar. The flak guns would open up, sharp, angry cracks that rattled in the chest, and then, in the darkness above, the RAF's Christmas trees appeared, slowly drifting down on silken parachutes, bathing the city in a ghastly green-white glow that marked it out for destruction. Wieck would later say he became more critical of bombing after the war. But at the time, he and his parents saw these raids as part of the only thing that could possibly save their lives, the victory of the Allies. Still, when the RAF returned for their second great raid, even he saw it as a catastrophe. That night, school books, curtains, and half-charred debris rained from the sky. The heat was so intense that many could not even leave their cellars. The streets glowed orange with the reflections of the flames. Some people leapt into the river to escape the fire, their silhouettes vanishing into the steam that rose from the black water, and when the raid was over, the heart of Königsberg looked, as Wieck put it, like the aftermath of an atomic explosion. Others saw it differently. Hans Siewek, a Hitler youth leader who had once served in the Führer's bodyguard, was revolted, not by the war itself, but by what he saw as the immorality of the British assault. It seemed crazy, he would say later, that people should destroy such a place. Königsberg, unlike other German cities, had been largely untouched before this. They didn't have the heavy anti-aircraft defences of Hamburg or Berlin. To Siewek, the raid felt like pointless vandalism. But worse, far worse, was on the horizon. By the autumn of 1944, the winds had turned cold and sharp. In the countryside, Hans von Lehndorff watched the storks begin their long migration south. As he stood in the fields and saw their graceful shapes dwindling against the pale sky, he thought what many East Prussians must have thought. Yes, you're flying away to safety, but what of us? What will become of us and of this land? They all knew now. East Prussia would be the first German soil to feel the full weight of the Red Army's advance. The province's ruler was Gauleiter Erich Koch, one of the most despised officials in the Reich. Years earlier, as Reich Commissioner in Ukraine, Koch had delivered a speech that even by Nazi standards was vicious. "We are a master race. The lowliest German worker is racially and biologically 1,000 times more valuable than the population here. We did not come to spread bliss. The population must work, work, and work again." Now, with the Soviet front drawing closer, Koch poured out promises that East Prussia would be held at all costs. He refused to permit any civilian evacuation. To allow it would be to admit the possibility of defeat. His orders were clear. Every German would hold fast to every inch of soil, no matter what came from the east. And it was not only Nazis who believed East Prussia's defense mattered. Every German now knew that if the war was lost, this land would be handed over to Poland. That decision had already been made, part of a cold bargain between the Allies in which eastern Poland would be absorbed into the Soviet Union and Poland would be compensated with German territory. The plan went even further. 16 million ethnic Germans across Eastern Europe, some newly settled under Hitler's colonization schemes, others whose families had lived there for centuries, were to be uprooted and driven into the shrunken borders of a post-war Germany. In London and Washington, there was little hesitation. In 1943, Roosevelt's aide Harry Hopkins wrote that the president saw it as the only way to keep the peace. Move the Prussians out, just as the Greeks had been moved from Turkey after the last war. Churchill was equally blunt in Parliament in December 1944. A clean sweep will be made. This was not just redrawing borders, it was the deliberate dismantling of Prussia, the historic core of German militarism. In Soviet captivity, senior German officers raged about what was coming. Friedrich Paulus, the defeated commander of Stalingrad, told fellow prisoners, "They want to take East Prussia from us. We can't just say to them, 'Here it is, take it.' If German land is given to Poland, there will be another war." General Strecker agreed. If they take East Prussia, it will mean another war, and this time will be blamed again. The war's new chapter began on 22nd October 1944, when the Soviet 11th Guards Army surged across the border and took the village of Nemmersdorf and several neighbouring hamlets. 4 days later, General Friedrich Hossbach's Fourth Army drove them back, but the villages they reclaimed were death grounds. Hardly a civilian had survived. The bodies of women were found nailed to barn doors and farm carts. Others had been abused and then crushed beneath tank tracks. Children were dead where they had fallen. 40 French prisoners of war working on local farms had been executed, as had several German communists. Karl Pottrek, a Volkssturm militiaman, was among the first to enter Nemmersdorf after the Germans retook it. His account was seared into memory. In a farmyard, a cart to which naked women were nailed through their hands in a crucifixion pose. At the Roter Krug Inn, barn doors with more women nailed in the same way. Inside the houses, they found 72 women and children, and one elderly man, all dead, many mutilated beyond recognition. It was not random savagery, but something systematic, a grim mirror of the worst Nazi crimes. Even the Soviets later showed unease. In Moscow's official history of the war, there was an uncharacteristic admission that in the first days of fighting in East Prussia, there had been some isolated violations of the correct norms of behaviour. But for those who walked the streets of Nemmersdorf, there was nothing isolated about it. It was a glimpse of what the Red Army would bring with them, again and again, until the war was over. Koch and Goebbels wasted no time turning the horror of Nemmersdorf into a weapon of their own. Photographers and journalists were dispatched to capture every grim tableau, the nailed bodies, the burned homes, the frozen corpses lying in the snow. The images appeared in newspapers, newsreels, and posters plastered to walls from Königsberg to Berlin. For the East Prussian public, these weren't just photographs, they were warnings, visual proof of what awaited them if the Soviets broke through. Women who saw them quietly asked pharmacists for vials of poison, just in case, and some, when the moment came, used them. Koch himself lived far from such desperation. Like many high-ranking Nazis, his life was a strange theatre of privilege in the middle of ruin. His estate, Gross Friedrich, stood outside Königsberg, dominated by a modern mansion built from bricks somehow procured when none were available to anyone else. Small, barrel-shaped, mustachioed, and quick to rage, Koch was no figure of elegance, but his hangers-on enjoyed his patronage, the parties, the private cinema screenings, even seats in his personal box at the theatre. When an RAF bombing raid sent a stick of bombs uncomfortably close to Gross Friedrich, he clenched his jaw and muttered, "That won't be allowed to happen again," as if he could bend the war to his will. To his secretaries he could sound entirely convincing, Lisa Lotte Kussner, just 23, typed his letters to the Führer on a special machine with oversized type to accommodate Hitler's poor eyesight. She believed every word about wonder weapons that would turn the tide, about the army holding the Russians at bay. "I had faith," she said years later. "I was so young." Faith alone, however, would not hold back the storm. Koch continued to forbid civilian evacuation, except for the border areas, where villages were hastily fortified. His orders were backed by posters declaring that any man who abandoned his home would be executed as a traitor. At Christmas, he sent a message to the soldiers. "We all know this battle, this matter of to be or not to be, can only have one outcome: victory, if we are to preserve our nation, our freedom, our bread, our future." He ended with a cheerful, "The Heimat wishes you a healthy Christmas." For the generals, it was more than propaganda. Heinz Guderian, the army's chief of staff, wrote that for Prussians it was their very homeland at stake, the land of their ancestors, their culture, their bones in the soil. The aristocracy, especially, clung to an almost romantic vision of the East, much as Southern planters had once clung to the Old South in America, a vision that made the thought of its loss unbearable. By January, the first refugees were already streaming west. They came with carts piled high with bedding, with children clinging to their mothers' skirts, and sometimes with herds of cattle trudging alongside them, the animals' breath steaming in the freezing air. Behind them, the war was closing in. A Wehrmacht report from Königsberg on 5th January told the truth plainly. The city's garrison would have to be made up of units retreating from the front, battered and depleted, short on tanks and guns. 90 Volkssturm battalions had been raised, but they were mostly men too old or too young for the regular army, and of the 22,800 rifles and 2,000 machine guns they were supposed to have, most simply didn't exist. The Soviets, under Generals Chernyakhovsky and Rokossovsky, held every advantage. In men, they outnumbered the Germans 10-1, in tanks 7-1, in artillery 20-1. By early January, 3,800 tanks and assault guns were gathered along the border. Stalin's orders were clear: smash into East Prussia, seize Königsberg, cut it off from the rest of Germany, and take the ports of Danzig and Stettin. Rokossovsky would shield Zhukov's flank to the south, while Chernyakhovsky drove for the heart of the province. Stalin warned his generals not to underestimate the fight. "The Germans will fight for East Prussia to the very end," he told Zhukov. "We could get bogged down there." On the morning of the 13th of January 1945, the ground shook. A thick, icy fog hung over the frontier, muffling the horizon, but not the sound. Chernyakhovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front opened fire with 120,000 rounds in just a few hours. The thunder of artillery could be heard 60 miles away in Königsberg. Hans von Lehndorff, listening in his home, said it was as if heavy lorries were idling all around the building without pause. The German defenders had been clever. Where possible, they had pulled back from the outpost line before the barrage began, leaving the Soviet shells to churn empty snowfields and abandoned trenches. When the Red Army infantry finally pushed forward, they found the villages ahead bristling with resistance. At key crossroads, German troops had fortified cellars into concrete bunkers, some topped with steel cupolas from which machine guns raked the streets. In one sector, Soviet tanks rolled forward into a narrow street, only to be met by a pair of concealed 75mm anti-tank guns that fired at almost point-blank range, the first round tearing through the lead T-34's armour, the second striking the one behind it, trapping the rest in a burning bottleneck. The Soviets returned fire, shells smashing into the buildings and sending bricks cascading into the road, but the defenders kept up their fire until the barrels of their MG-42s glowed red. Everywhere, slogans painted in huge black letters stared down from walls. "The destiny of the fatherland lies with you. Our cities can be stilled, but not our hearts." For the men crouching behind sandbags or peering down rifle sights, these weren't just words. They were the only thing left to cling to. On the other side, Soviet soldiers had their own orders. Political officers reminded them daily of the crimes committed in this very land. "You now tread the ground that gave birth to the fascist monsters who devastated our homes and slaughtered our families. An eye for an eye." Meetings were held before the offensive with titles like "How Shall I Avenge Myself?" Hatred was not an afterthought, it was fuel. When the Red Army came, it came in waves. Tanks advanced behind rolling curtains of artillery fire, infantry close behind. Soviet submachine gunners dashed from wall to wall, spraying doorways and windows before storming inside. German grenadiers fought from the rubble, often holding a position until they were killed or out of ammunition. In one sector near the Tilsit Road, a Soviet assault was beaten back 3 times in a single day, only for the defenders to be forced out that night when another column slipped in through the frozen woods and struck from the rear. It was the beginning of a fight that would turn East Prussia into a killing ground, a battle where every street, every village, and every field would be contested, and where, for many, survival would become a matter of hours, not days. Early Soviet signals from the front painted a strange picture. The towns of Tilsit, Hernbigge, Tallinn, Rognit, all eerily empty. No cheering crowds, no panicked mobs, just streets without life. Water and electricity had been cut, but the houses still held wardrobes full of clothes, pantries stocked, and furniture untouched. Interrogated prisoners explained why most civilians had been evacuated weeks earlier. For Soviet soldiers, many of whom had never travelled beyond their villages, the sight was staggering. They wandered the cobblestone streets of East Prussia like men stepping into another world. Lieutenant Gennady Klimenko marvelled. German villages looked like heaven compared with ours. Everything was cultivated. There were so many beautiful buildings. They had so much more than we did. Vladimir Gormin agreed, awestruck. Great country, so clean and tidy compared to ours. But admiration had its price. Political officers fretted that such sights contradicted years of propaganda about socialism's superiority. The gleaming houses, tidy gardens, and solid roads whispered a dangerous truth, that the enemy's land was richer than their own. Rage at this disparity mixed with years of loss and fed the hunger to destroy. Many would take their revenge not only on the enemy's soldiers, but on his very way of life. The propaganda war continued to burn even amid the fighting. Soviet NKVD men, advancing with Chernyakhovsky's troops, discovered a mass grave in a forest near Kumenen. 100 Jewish women, tortured and shot, most between 18 and 35. Many still wore yellow stars, some had potatoes in their pockets. They had been starved before being executed. Moscow made certain this was reported, just as German propaganda had made Nemmersdorf a rallying cry. But for every atrocity uncovered, new ones were committed. One Soviet officer described his first sight of East Prussian civilians, 2 very old men in the road. His men bayoneted them without hesitation. That was the war now. No formalities, no prisoners, just an endless cycle of vengeance. It took Chernyakhovsky a week of grinding assaults to crack the German front. His infantry fought through minefields and across frozen ditches under the roar of German artillery hidden in woods and villages. Streets turned into barricades of overturned wagons, farm carts, and rubble. Soviet tank crews, fighting in whitewashed T-34s for camouflage, pushed forward only to be met by sudden bursts from Panzerfausts, fired at near point-blank range from behind snow walls. Each breakthrough was paid for with blood. When the German line finally broke, the Volkssturm and Volksgrenadier divisions began to fall back in disorder. Rokossovsky's forces, advancing from the south since 14 January, were already in motion on Chernyakhovsky's flank. By 23 January, Soviet troops had forced the rivers Daim, Pregel, and Alle, the last natural barriers before Königsberg. By the 27th, the trap was nearly closed. Only a thin corridor to the sea kept the garrison connected to the rest of the Reich. For most Soviet soldiers, the naivety with which they entered East Prussia was staggering. Major Yuri Ryakovsky believed without question that Americans were supplying the Wehrmacht with vehicles for capitalist reasons. One corporal hauled a 10-year-old boy before his commander, claiming he'd seen the child poison a well. The colonel, to his credit, cuffed the boy and sent him away, a rare act of mercy in those days. From the first day of their advance, the Red Army looted on a colossal scale. It wasn't just tolerated, it was systemized. Each soldier was allowed to send home a monthly parcel of spoils. On German soil, the bounty was intoxicating. Food, wine, clocks, livestock, jewellery. Corporal Anatoly Osminov once walked into a billet to find a soldier sitting naked at a grand piano, plinking at the keys with his toes while staring into a gilt-framed mirror. In white camouflage smocks, soldiers fought, died, and pillaged, their progress slowed as much by the snow as by their own greed. Captain Vasily Krylov, a reconnaissance officer, looked out over the plains of East Prussia and thought it resembled a vast untouched bedsheet. At the border, a Red Army sign declared, "You are now in accursed Germany, on to Berlin." His column of Katyusha trucks often ground to a halt behind streams of fleeing civilians. They pushed through, and when opportunity arose, his men looted like the rest. Krylov tried to keep control, but admitted it was very hard. Orders to curb looting were ignored, even laughed at. How could we be merciful, asked poet-soldier David Samilov, to a nation that had brought such misery on Russia? When locals tried to stop the theft, the soldiers burned their homes. A group of liberated Russian women tried to explain to an officer which Germans were good and which were bad. He cut them off. "We don't have time to classify fascists." The sheer volume of loot overwhelmed the 32-pound parcel limit. "You could hardly send an accordion," Krylov joked, though his orderly managed to post a full porcelain tea set to his family. When Krylov finally returned home after the war, his mother and sister were wearing the dresses he'd sent from East Prussia in January 45. Not long after, the Red Army overran Rastenburg, Hitler's wolf's lair. The complex was eerily empty, its bunkers and reinforced buildings abandoned. Soldiers wandered its concrete corridors, marvelling at the scale of the defences. In the commandant's office, they found an order dated 8th January binding all personnel to secrecy about the Führer's affairs. One soldier flipped through the telephone directory. Hitler's extension, he noted with a grin, was simply 1. Lieutenant Alexander Sergeyev's men moved through silent villages where ovens were still warm, and bread sat untouched on tables. Forced labourers lingered in barns alongside cattle. Special teams rounded up the livestock and herded it eastward, just as they rounded up the liberated labourers for reassignment to Soviet factories, or in the case of those deemed dangerous, to NKVD camps. But even in these easy captures, danger lurked. German booby traps were everywhere. Lieutenant Alexander Markov recalled opening a door only to have it explode in his men's faces. After that, they looped telephone cables around handles and yanked from a safe distance. It worked, but nothing could protect them from the Red Army's deadliest weakness: alcohol. In one captured railway station, Markov's brigade discovered a tanker full of pure spirit. Men drank it from mess tins, bottles, even helmets. Within hours, half the unit was reeling or unconscious when the Germans counter-attacked. Somehow, through a haze of drunken confusion, the brigade managed to hold its position. But it was a close-run thing, a reminder that in East Prussia, disaster could come from the enemy, or from your own side. The Red Army's behaviour in East Prussia was never uniform. In some villages, its first appearance brought not murder, but bread. One winter morning, in a small church where the locals prayed for mercy, the doors opened to reveal Soviet officers, not with guns raised but with loaves in their hands. "The Russians have been here half a day," one astonished German woman murmured, "and we are still alive." But such kindness came with a warning. We can vouch for our people, but not for those coming behind. The "those" were the great unruly masses that trailed the spearheads, men who, once unleashed, turned abuse and destruction into a weapon against an entire people. In East Prussia, the violation of women became not merely an act of lust but of conquest, carried out with a brutal and almost ritualistic certainty. At first it seemed Königsberg would collapse within days. Soviet units were already on the edge of the city, and for a moment the Germans wavered. But then came a desperate counterstroke. The 372nd Infantry Division, with assault guns rumbling at its flanks, was rushed into the line north of the city. They arrived in the nick of time, halting the Soviet advance and knocking out 30 tanks in furious close-range fighting. Königsberg would not fall, not yet. Now besieged, the city clung to life through a narrow coastal strip to the Baltic, supplied by sea and defended by naval gunfire. Inside, the call went out for every able body. Boys and old men poured into the Volkssturm. 17-year-old Joseph Volmar was at his Luftwaffe glider school on the 20th of January when the order came. That morning, in blowing snow, he and his classmates were marched 2 miles to the nearest station. The platform was chaos. a crush of soldiers, Volkssturm men, and terrified refugees trying to board anything that moved west. Volmar's group fought their way into a train bound for the city, their breath freezing in clouds in the bitter air. At Königsberg they were assembled before an overworked infantry captain, his face grey with fatigue. "Men, or boys, or whatever you are," he rasped, "you've been assigned to my command for the heroic defence of Königsberg. I hope you'll do justice to yourselves when the time comes." Their weapons were relics, French long rifles from 1914, each with 25 rounds. One boy was given a Czech machine gun, only for the sergeant to curse when he found that only Polish ammunition was available for it. Loaded onto a city bus under a Hitler youth leader, they rolled through snowbound streets, an NCO trying to coax them into singing Edelweiss. At first, they joined in hesitantly, but as they passed columns of refugees trudging through the snow, faces hollow, scarves iced over, children bundled into sleds, the singing faltered. The boys stared out at the frostbitten misery, their morning sense of adventure shrivelling into unease, then dread. They travelled 30 miles into darkness, passing weary soldiers trudging in the opposite direction. Then came the crump of shellfire. The bus stopped in an abandoned village, the windows of its houses black and blind. They were billeted in 2 houses beside the church. When someone asked about food, their sergeant only shrugged. They scavenged through the village until they found a smouldering supply dump, salvaging cheese and bottles of wine before wrapping themselves in greatcoats and falling into fitful sleep. 4 hours later, the sergeant's shout cut through the cold. "Up! Outside! The Ruskies are coming!" 90 boys stumbled into the snow and were marched to an embankment beside the railway. They'd barely begun to dig in before the first Soviet mortars fell. One shell burst, sent a boy tumbling down the slope, clutching his stomach. "Say farewell to my mother," he whispered to Volmar before dying. All around, cries of "Sanitator! Medic!" rang out. Volmar tried to load his rifle, but found the bolt frozen solid. Nearby, the machine gunner was bleeding badly. Volmar fumbled with a tourniquet as more shells came down. Russian infantry were now visible through the drifting snow, advancing steadily. For 4 hours, the boys held on, firing when they could, watching their comrades fall. Finally, the NCO shouted, "We can't hold! Get across the tracks and make for the river. Bring the wounded if you can." But most could not be moved. Volmar tried to drag one boy who had been shot in the leg. "Don't let them take me," the boy begged. Then Volmar saw a Russian soldier 50 yards away with a submachine gun, and in a moment that would haunt him, let go. He ran, dropping helmet, gas mask, even his beloved camera, as bursts of fire tore the snow. Just as he crossed the railway tracks, a bullet smashed into his arm, spinning him sideways. Somehow, he made it over the frozen river, where a medic wrapped the wound roughly and gave him a swig of wine. He collapsed into sleep and awoke on a truck bound for Königsberg. At the hospital, they pulled the 7.65mm round from his arm without anesthetic. 20 of his 90 teenage comrades never returned. One of the men who commanded Hitler Youth formations like Volmar's was Hans Civic, 25, a Berliner with Austrian roots. He had once stood in the Leibstandarte's ranks, proud to serve in Hitler's personal bodyguard. He remembered the Führer speaking to him about a samurai sword on display in his quarters and insisted Hitler could be a real softie. But Civic's SS career had faltered when he failed his officer's course. Now, in East Prussia, he commanded boys, not soldiers, and the fight for Königsberg was only beginning. In the first bleak days of 1945, Gauleiter Erich Koch summoned Hans Civic and gave him an order that even for those times felt mad. "Form Hitler Youth battle groups," Koch told him. "Do it any way you like. Just stop the tanks." There was no grand plan, no training schedule, just a desperate instruction to throw children into the path of Soviet armor. Civic gathered his recruits, companies of around 200, most of them only 16, some no more than 13. Their rifles were relics, First World War Mauser 90s, heavy and long enough that some boys struggled to carry them properly. A soldier who watched one of these units march out never forgot the sight. The oldest might have been 16, but there were others, little more than children. They wore worn uniforms cut for grown men, hanging loose on their frames. Their rifles looked as big as they were. They tried to look soldierly, but their eyes had the unease of pupils on the first day back at school. Some laughed, shoving each other, still too young to master military discipline. A few carried their school satchels, now packed by their mothers, with scraps of food and spare clothing instead of books. Some traded the sickly sweet candies given in children's rations. What could be done with such troops? Where could they fight? Was this heroism or madness? At first, Siwick's battle group was put to work digging anti-tank ditches, their frozen hands blistering on the shovels. But on the 20th of January, the order came to move. A single anti-tank gun was loaded onto a truck, and Siwick was told to take his company 30 miles southeast of Königsberg. They drove through deep snow, the boys' breath frosting the air inside the vehicles. At first they were excited, jostling for a view out the canvas flaps. The trucks ground to a halt by a sunken road, and the boys stumbled out into the cold. They dug in beside the road, setting up the gun in the middle, the trench lines running like scars across the white ground. Then came the waiting, long hours in the freezing stillness. Late in the afternoon, movement appeared on the horizon. Figures emerged through the mist, the dark shapes of Soviet infantry advancing in line, and behind them the hulking silhouettes of 3 T-34s. "Open fire!" Siwick called. Mauser bolts slammed forward, and the first shots cracked out. The boys fired eagerly at first, but the old rifles began to jam in the cold. Siwick dashed from foxhole to foxhole, clearing bolts with numbed fingers, urging them to keep shooting. The Soviets closed to within 80 yards before, to the Germans' surprise, pulling back as the light faded. The boys, utterly spent, curled into the snow and slept where they lay. Dawn brought the second assault, this time with mortars. Shells whistled in and burst among the trenches, hurling snow, dirt, and body parts into the air. Siwick had once told Hitler himself that he hoped for a posting where he might win a medal. Now, crouching in the snow as his teenage recruits screamed for medics, he realized medals meant nothing. The only victory was to delay the Russians long enough for the columns of refugees behind them to escape. When a truckload of Panzerfausts arrived mid-morning, the boys looked at them blankly. Few had any idea how to use them. Shots were fired wildly, one hitting nothing, another skipping harmlessly into the snow. Then, by sheer luck, one found its mark. A T-34 shuddered to a halt, smoke billowing from its hatches before the crew scrambled out, only to be cut down by rifle fire. The small Triumph lifted spirits for only a moment before the mortars found them again. Shirts were torn into makeshift bandages, wounded boys lay shivering in the snow. Then, in the distance, came the low, rising growl of engines. Siwick turned, expecting another Soviet push. But what came was a column of German panzers. The lead tank halted, and a black-uniformed officer dropped down from the turret. He looked over the scene, the ragged foxholes, the shivering boys clutching rifles almost as tall as themselves, and barked in disbelief. "What the hell is this? Get them out of here." The order was a blessing. The boys scrambled from their positions and trudged rearwards, leaving 6 dead and 15 wounded in the snow. The rest marched in silence, their earlier patriotism gone. The boys were traumatized, Siwick admitted later. Their patriotism had shriveled away. His own enthusiasm for combat had gone with it. As the refugee columns pressed towards the coast, Siwick told his company to throw away their rifles and find civilian clothes if they could. They were all from towns the Russians now held. I could not send them home. Keeping his own uniform, he used his party connections to get space for himself and a handful of boys aboard a naval supply ship in the port of Pillau. 2 days later, they reached the temporary safety of Stettin. For the boys left behind, there would be no such reprieve. By the end of January 1945, most of East Prussia was gone. What remained to Germany were isolated pockets, the fortress city of Königsberg, the port of Pillau, and a few frozen scraps of coastline. Inside them, the German army fought 2 desperate battles at once, to hold the last bastions against the Soviet tide and to keep open a narrow escape route along the Baltic for the hundreds of thousands of refugees still trapped in the province. It was a fight measured not in steady gains or neat lines on a map, but in constant reversals. Ground taken one day, lost the next. On 30th of January, a Soviet thrust towards the Königsberg-Pillau railway brought disaster for a refugee train. A T-34 blocked the tracks, its steel hull halting the engine. Then came the gunfire, Soviet infantry raking the carriages, forcing the passengers out into the snow. What followed was chaos, looting, beatings, and abuse inflicted on those who couldn't fight back. The city's main shield was held by the 5th Panzer Division and the battle-hardened 1st East Prussian Infantry Division. In mid-February, the garrison and German forces on the Samland Peninsula launched a ferocious counterattack, hammering their way towards Pillau to reopen the lifeline. On the 20th of February, they succeeded, a feat bought with heavy losses, but enough to let a flood of civilians move west. 100,000 fled during that brief window. The reprieve didn't last. On the 26th of February, the Soviets simply tightened their cordon and waited. Chernyakhovsky's 39th and 43rd armies were ordered to mask the city and hold position. Königsberg could wait. There was no chance it could alter the Soviet timetable for victory. South of the city, Rokossovsky's 2nd Belarusian front was sweeping the province clear. German commanders begged Berlin to let 4th Army fall back before it was surrounded. Hitler refused. Ammunition was already critically low. 4th Army's own report warned on 19 January that any further losses would precipitate a serious crisis. Still, the order came to hold. Guderian himself admitted to Reinhardt, commander of Army Group North, that everything is going to collapse, but gave the order anyway. When withdrawal was finally permitted, the moment had passed. Stalin, impatient with Königsberg's resistance, shifted Rokossovsky's armies north to seal off East Prussia entirely from the rest of Germany. The move smashed into the German 4th Army's long flank along the frozen Frisches Haff, and into the masses of civilians trekking west across the snow. On 21st January, Soviet tanks reached Elbing, firing into the crush of refugees on the roads. The next day, they rolled into Allenstein, overrunning German reinforcements as they stepped off their trains. By the 23rd, Elbing itself was under assault. T-34s clashing with desperate Panzerfaust teams in the streets. The Soviets pulled back after heavy losses, but they now held most of the near shore of the Haff. Only a narrow sand spit, the Frisches Haff, still linked the trapped civilians to the west. That link was almost lost. Berlin still demanded the front hold fast, but the local commanders disobeyed. With 400,000 troops and civilians at stake, 4th Army counterattacked under a moonlit sky on 26 January. They smashed the Soviet 48th Army and reached Elbing again, prying open a passage. Hitler's fury was swift. Reinhardt and Hossbach were both sacked, but for the refugees, it meant life. Across the Baltic to Balkans front, armies fought amid an endless backdrop of civilian flight. Nowhere was the suffering greater than in East Prussia. Refugee columns stretched for miles, carts piled with bedding and possessions, women clutching infants against the cold, children crying until their voices gave out. Often they marched past burning villages and abandoned bodies, the sky lit with the glow of distant battles. To the Soviet spearheads, they were obstacles, not innocents. To 34s ploughed through the crowd, scattering people like debris. Artillery fire crashed into columns without warning. Sometimes it was calculated, sometimes it was indifference. Always it was deadly. The cold and hunger killed as surely as bullets. Many East Prussians would forever lay the blame on Gauleiter Koch, whose refusal to evacuate early had doomed them. But Soviet shells and machine guns did the killing. The Red Army's policy owed less to military necessity than to vengeance. For 4 years, Moscow's propagandists, men like Ilya Ehrenberg, had told the Soviet soldier that the German people themselves were guilty and that punishment must be total. The message had sunk deep. And yet, against this tide, the German army fought on, sometimes with astonishing skill, holding corridors open just long enough for civilians to pass. It was a bitter, doomed heroism, a winter of blood and ice, where the only victory was measured in how many people could escape before the noose closed. In the early weeks of 1945, 13-year-old Waltrop-Tak found herself in a world where even children spoke casually of suicide if the Russians came. Wild rumors spread through her schoolroom. One claimed the Soviets would use poison gas. Her father was a cobbler in Lutzen, making boots for the Wehrmacht. Christmas had been a muted affair. They didn't even have a tree. Her eldest brother, Günther, had been killed at Aachen. On 23rd January, they left their home just hours ahead of the Soviet advance, dragging a sled laden with food and blankets. Waltraud begged to take her doll, but her father was firm. It had to stay. Along the route to the nearest station, they abandoned treasured possessions piece by piece, lightening the sled for the long pull. At the tracks, they joined the chaotic crowd, waiting for a train. Hours passed as troop trains thundered through, soldiers forward, wounded back. At last, a sympathetic soldier waved them onto a freight train that crawled west, stopping again and again. Then came grim news. The Russians were already in Elbing. The train was shunted back east. A few miles later, everyone was ordered off. In the dark, they stumbled to the edge of the Frisches Haff. Days of scavenging for food followed as artillery drew nearer. On the 5th of February, her father managed to secure places for the children and his elderly mother on a truck crossing the frozen lagoon. At a checkpoint, soldiers tried to force 16-year-old Horst Patak to stay and join the Volkssturm. Her father argued desperately, winning Horst's release but being conscripted himself. They said goodbye on the ice. Rain fell, turning snow to slush, and Waltraud saw the frozen corpse of an old man lying nearby. They made it across and huddled in an earthen shelter with dozens of others, surviving the night by shared warmth. The next day the sun came out, and so did Soviet aircraft. Waltraud watched the bombs fall, tiny specks becoming shattering blasts in the ice. People were thrown into the freezing water. Many people died that day. Her younger brother tried to calm a terrified, stampeding horse, while others lay flat on the ice. In Pillau, they waited 3 days for her father. He never came. As the guns closed in, they fought for space on a freighter, lying on straw in the hold, until they reached Danzig on the 20th of February. The rest of the war was spent as refugees in a deserted villa in Pomerania. They never learned her father's fate. Far from the ice, 20-year-old Eleanor Bergsdorf returned to her family's estate, Wildenhof, just after Christmas 1944. Her stepfather, Graf von Schwerin, a Baroque aristocrat with little love for the Nazis, commanded a Volkssturm unit. On leaving for the front, he left behind his gold pin, a silent acknowledgement that he would not return. The news came on the 16th of January. Eleanor took a train to Königsberg to tell her mother. In the hotel room, she said simply, "Kaps is dead." Her mother slumped back into the bedclothes, and grief made her unresponsive to talk of escape. At Wildenhof, they sealed valuables in the cellars. Priceless volumes from the Königsberg Museum lay on the shelves. Eleanor took the oldest and most impressive. A Ukrainian art historian, billeted as custodian of looted icons from Kiev, refused to flee. "When the Russians come, I shall set fire to the whole place and everything in it." The tenants were equally certain they would survive as they had in 1914, but Eleanor and her mother left, boarding a train to Brownsburg that took 18 hours for a 1-hour journey. They then joined a wagon convoy, passing frozen corpses of infants in the snow. They were among the first to cross the Haff's ice on 24th January, narrowly avoiding disaster when a wheel slipped over open water. They never saw Wildenhof again. The Ukrainian kept her word. She died in the flames with the house. Elsewhere, Gauleiter Erich Koch, the man who had forbidden early evacuation, told his secretary Lisa-Lotte Kussner, "You must go tonight." Within hours, a small convoy of tractors and trailers was moving, carrying Belgian POWs, women, children, and an old man. A broken tractor nearly halted them, but Koch, on the telephone, barked, "Keep going, the Russians are at Elbing." At the Vistula ferry, they skipped the queue by waking the children and making them cry for sympathy. Crossing into safety, they drove through columns of weary refugees trudging through the snow. In Stralsund, they ran out of fuel, but a cousin in the navy bartered food for diesel. By late April, they had reached the Elbe, far luckier than most who fled. In Berlin, the tide of refugees from the east shocked and unsettled the population. Columns of trucks arrived, laden with sacks, bedding, and children peering wide-eyed from under headscarves. Some Berliners offered aid. Others recalled bitterly that these same regions had been untouched, while the West burned under Allied bombs. The Wehrmacht estimated 3.5 million Germans were already on the move. By the end of January, Joseph Vollmar, the glider pilot cadet wounded in the arm, lay in a Königsberg hospital. Ordered to Pillau, he joined a column of walking wounded. A truck carried them the final miles to the docks, where chaos reigned, abandoned carts, crowds fighting for space on damaged ships, Russian shells falling in the harbour. Packed into the hold, they endured a stinking voyage to Swinemünde, then on to Lübeck, where he learned his arm was shattered. On the same docks, 20-year-old Elfriede Kowitz watched people fall into the water or be pushed aside in the scramble to board. Russian warships shelled the harbour. She failed to secure a place and instead left with a Luftwaffe convoy crossing the Haff under artillery fire. Temperatures were freezing, lorries were destroyed, and the dead lay abandoned in the snow. Some refugees, seeing this, turned back, hoping the Russians might spare them. By early February, the Soviets reported that Königsberg's last supply line, the highway along the Frisches Haff, was under constant artillery and machine gun fire. Yet in fog or darkness, supplies still got through. Inside the city, 1 million civilians, locals and refugees, faced shortages, typhoid, and constant bombardment. Gestapo patrols executed looters and those urging surrender. In late February, a Nazi propaganda officer told the wounded that hundreds of tanks had arrived in Pillau, that a relief force was advancing from the south, and that the Russians had been let in on purpose. The wounded were urged to see Kohlberg in the theatre to keep their spirits up. Outside, looters picked through ruins, while military police dragged every able-bodied man and boy into the snowbound defences. The siege would only grow tighter, and far deadlier, in the weeks ahead. By early April 1945, Königsberg had been under siege for weeks, a cold, battered city surrounded on 3 sides by the Red Army, and on the 4th by the frozen waters of the Frisches Haff. The once proud capital of East Prussia was now little more than a maze of shattered buildings, burned-out trams, and cratered streets. 1 million civilians were trapped alongside the garrison, clinging to rumours of relief forces that would never come. The Soviets had been content to contain the city since February, but in the first days of April, orders came from Moscow. Königsberg must fall. Marshal Alexander Vasilevsky massed his guns and armour for the final blow. On the morning of the 6th of April, after a bombardment that shook the earth for hours, the Soviet infantry surged forward under a sky that seemed to rain fire. Entire districts disappeared beneath clouds of dust and smoke. The defenders, the 5th Panzer Division, 1st Infantry Division, scattered Volkssturm and hastily armed civilians, clung to street corners and bunkers, firing until their rifles overheated. For 2 days, the battle raged, block by block. Soviet tanks ground through barricades, often firing point-blank into buildings where machine gunners fought to the last belt of ammunition. Civilians were caught in the crossfire or forced from cellars to act as human shields for the advancing infantry. Those who tried to flee towards Pillau found the roads under constant artillery fire. On the night of 7th April, the fighting reached the heart of the city. Fires lit the skyline as shells ripped through Königsberg's medieval quarters. Churches collapsed into heaps of stone and ash. The defenders fell back towards the old fortress bastions, a ring of 19th century forts that now became the last redoubt. In Fort 5, surrounded and cut off, a handful of panzer grenadiers fought with bayonets when their ammunition was gone. By 9th April, General Otto Lasch, the city's commander, knew the end was inevitable. Food was gone, water scarce, and ammunition almost spent. Reports came in of Soviet troops breaking through at multiple points. At midday, Lasch sent envoys to the Soviet lines under a white flag. The fighting slowed, then stopped. The siege had lasted 60 hours. Königsberg had endured 88 days of isolation before that. When the Soviet troops entered, they found a city of ruins, its streets littered with the dead, its people hollow-eyed and silent. For many civilians, the ordeal was not over. Thousands would be deported eastward in the weeks that followed. For the Red Army, Königsberg was another victory on the road to Berlin, but one bought at a high price, in a place where war had bled the land white. And so East Prussia's capital, once the seat of Prussian kings and a symbol of German power in the East, vanished into history not with a sudden collapse, but with a slow, grinding fall. A tragedy sealed in fire, hunger, and the unrelenting march of armies.